In this video, I'm going to show you how to capture long exposures of clouds at sunset. The thing about sunset photography is the light is constantly changing. So one exposure setting might work for 5 minutes, but it's going to change and you need to readjust. So let's look at that in this video. I'm going to be using my 24-70 here, and I'm going to use a Lee Filters filter holder to attach either an ND 10 or an ND 6, which is going to be 6 stops or 10 stops of exposure, which will allow me to do a long exposure. Now you'll see the sun is just setting on this rocky outgrowth in the background there, and we've actually waited for this sun to go down a little bit, because if that's really bright and we're doing a long exposure and down here is quite dark, we're going to have a really horrible contrast of light in the frame. So we've waited for that light to disappear, and now is just the right time as we're starting to hit that soft light. We're about 10 minutes before sunset here, so within about 15 minutes we'll hopefully start to see some of these clouds change colour. Now the sun has set over that way, so there's a good chance they won't change colour too much, but you can still get some light. As you can see, there's still light breaking through the mountains here and onto the clouds in the background. We've chosen this scene because the clouds are actually moving relatively fast in the background, and they're scattered, which allows us to get individual bits of blur in our scene. So what we'll do first of all is we're going to focus our scene. I've got my camera in aperture priority mode. I'm going to turn live view on, and I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to use autofocus. Autofocus helps to get set up easily. You can also obviously use manual focus, but I like to be able to zoom in to exactly where I want the focus to be and then use autofocus and see that that is set. Now that autofocus is set, I'm going to switch to manual focus, and I'm going to be very careful not to touch the focusing ring at all. If I touch that at all, it's going to change the focus and I'll have to readjust it later. So now that that's set, I'm going to switch to manual mode, and I'm going to turn off live view. Probably not going to use f22 because I'm going to have probably either a 6 or a 10 ND stop filter. I'm going to switch down, so let's just do f11, ISO 100, and I'm going to adjust the shutter speed until I find that the exposure is correct. So here it's saying 1/15 of a second. If I take a photo now, and let me just take that, you can see, yeah, that's a well exposed photograph. Now that I know what the exposure settings are going to be, I'm going to use an ND stop filter to give myself a longer exposure, and with the help of an app called PhotoPills, I'll be able to set these settings correctly. So I'm going to set this here to f11, and it was 1/15 of a second in ISO 100. That's my settings, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a filter here. We'll start with, let's start with 6. I'll do the same again, f11, and it's going to tell me that I actually want to have a 4-second exposure with a 6-stop ND filter. So we'll start with the 6-stop. I'm going to put it into the front of the holder here, so the very first slide in. If you put it in the back one, you might get some light leakage around the edge, which you want to avoid. And I'm just going to slip it onto the end of my camera. And now with everything set manually, I can either set a 4-second exposure in my camera, I can set it in the velometer, or I can just count to myself and do it in bulb mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it inside the camera just to start with. And that's a 4-second exposure. I'll hit go on the intervalometer, and 4 seconds later we're going to see some movement in the clouds. Now 4 seconds is not very long for the speed at which these clouds are moving. In fact, I dare say it's a little bit too short. So what I can do instead is I can switch to a 10-stop ND filter, and I'll do this now, 10 stops here, and now the shutter speed should be 1 minute and 8 seconds. If that seems like it's going to be too long and the blurs are too exaggerated, I can then adjust the ISO or the f-stop to bring this back. So 1 minute and 8 seconds. I'll change these filters out now. So now, because this is a 1 minute exposure and I can only set 30 seconds in manual mode, I'm going to switch from manual mode into bulb mode. Make sure those settings are the same, so f11, ISO 100. And now I'm going to control the exposure with my intervalometer. So while on the long setting, I'm going to set it to, I forget what it was, 1 minute and 8 seconds. So I'll set it to 1 minute and 8 seconds. And now I'm going to press the start stop button, and this is going to take 1:08 exposure. And hopefully we'll get a little bit more of that movement. I like how the background's starting to change color here. We've got a little bit of contrast between the orange and the gray, and then we've got the green and the brown as well in the foreground. It should turn out to be a really nice photo. In fact, the clouds over here that are moving are really quite gorgeous now. So another 45 seconds or so on this exposure, and we'll have hopefully a nice image of some cloud blur. But I have to say, while looking at this scene, I think the clouds are moving just a little bit too fast. So with that in mind, maybe later on the 6-stop's going to work really well, or maybe I want to adjust my ISO or my f-stop number, my aperture, so I can get a shorter exposure time of around 30 seconds. It's all about experimentations until you get that look that you're going for. Long exposure is a little bit tricky because the scene is constantly changing. The light is changing, the speed at which your subject is moving is changing, what's in the scene is changing. It's constant experimentation, but that's the fun of it. That's how you get the best shots. And yeah, as I predicted, it is a little bit too long. So I'm going to switch from bulb mode back to manual mode. I'll take the leaf filter off. It's going to make a really bad estimate of what the exposure should be with this on. So if I do this, I can experiment with exposure lengths. And it's asking for at f22 less than half a second. So not much we can do here with this balance, because if I put f22 in, well, I tell you what, let's have a look, and we'll open up Photo Pills. So now it's telling me at 10 stops it's going to be a 6-minute exposure. That's far too long. Let's go back down to 6 stops. It's saying 25 seconds. That might be just right. So I'm going to change this filter out now. We have to be fairly quick because, as I mentioned, the light is constantly changing. Let's put this in front. And I'll set the manual here to 25 seconds. And usually if it's just a short exposure time, you don't want to touch the camera because that camera shake is going to be captured as motion blur. Not the good kind, but the bad kind of the camera moving. Now with the 25-second exposure, it is going to be indistinguishable in the scene. So you can just press on the camera there, or if you want to make a good habit of it, always use a remote or an intervalometer. Now we're starting to get some really cool scenes. So I'm just going to adjust the composition a little bit, give a little bit more focus to the clouds over here. Maybe even go a little bit wider. "25 seconds seems to be about right for this scene. But as you see, it's experimentation. You have to be quite fast, especially as the sun's setting. So the sun set 4 minutes ago now. So we're going to start to lose light, and these clouds are going to change color to that orange glow that they have now. If we're lucky, we'll get a little bit of pink, but as soon as that pink is done, we're only going to see gray clouds, which is not really as good. So while that's a nice composition, I think I prefer just having that rock over here, and maybe if we focus a little bit more on the sea here, we'll get nice contrast between the sea, the clouds, the ground. And I'll try that again. Now I haven't adjusted the exposure here, but I'm looking out at this sky. I know that's going to be brighter, and that's probably going to make the photo a little bit more exposed. Now, it's long exposure, I'm shooting in RAW, I can bring some of this back in post, so I'm not too worried. It's better to take the photo now and adjust it later, because with time constraints that do come up when you're taking long exposures, you really just have to be fast and think on your feet. And that actually looks quite good. I think one more thing is I'm just going to go back to that original composition. It's good to experiment, and I actually want a slightly shorter exposure. Let me see if I can find a way to do that. I think I'm probably best off just underexposing a little bit. Maybe I'll do a 15-second exposure here, and then I can always adjust that later in post, but at least I don't get too much of a blur. As you can probably see, the clouds are changing color now, so they're no longer orange. We've just got a little bit of light left in them, and then they're going to go gray, at which point we'll get some good results, but it won't be quite as beautiful as it is now. So I'm going to get a couple more photos, and then we'll probably be done here. That's really nice. That's a good length of time, 15 seconds. Dare say I might even try 10 seconds. Wow, over here, we now have that orange glow from the sunset. So I might try and do a wide angle, get some of this cacti in here. We've got some cars in the road down here. They won't be as noticeable, but we'll be able to see something. They're probably going a little bit too fast to capture as motion blur. We need a little bit more light. So I'm going to change the aperture to f16. Keep it 15-second exposure. When you know how these clouds are going to change color, it's much easier to be agile and faster to move to capture these things. So just be aware when you set up your composition how the scene might change. And dare I say, I'm just going to go a little bit closer here. Get a bit more of the road in. Clouds are starting to move faster now than they were 5 minutes ago. With that being said though, I do want a slightly longer exposure. So I'll change that to 20 seconds. This could be a cool shot because we have some bikes moving through the scene and we've got their tail lights. Let's see if we can get a bit more of that because they've got headlights on now. They're going to come up this road, which would be a nice addition. One of them's blue actually. You can see the light trails, but you can't really see the bikes. And let's do another 30-second exposure. It should accentuate these clouds a little bit more because as I zoom out, it's going to be less obvious that they're moving through the scene. So the shape of the clouds are actually quite interesting. There's some texture to them. I think 30 seconds kind of blurs that out a little bit too much. So that was 30 seconds and the one before was 20. I think 20 does a better job of capturing the shape and texture of these clouds. So I'm going to go back now to 20 seconds. Maybe we'll do 15 just as an experimentation. Now I'm halving the exposure time there. So I'm obviously going to need to add more light back into the scene to keep that same exposure. So going from 30 seconds to 15, I'm going to want to move one stop of my aperture as well. So that was, I think, f18. So I'll move from f18 to f13 just to maintain that same exposure. So I went from 30 seconds down to 15. I halved it, that's one stop. So I've gone from f18 to f13. I've changed the exposure by one stop there as well. So I've made one stop more light and I removed one stop of light when I changed the shutter speed. And I do think 15 is just perfect here because you still get to maintain the structure and the texture of these clouds. Over here it's turning a little bit orange in the dark areas too. So much so that I'm going to just readjust the composition and see if I can get just this focused on. We got some trees there. You see just how quickly it changes. So the sunset 15 minutes ago, and now we have just a hint of pink and orange over there. And over here it's completely grey clouds. So you have to adjust when these things happen. Focus on the interesting part, which is that over there. Yeah, it's not that interesting of a composition, especially with this cacti in the frame. I think I'll go back to that other one just because it's a little bit better for a final shot. And I'm going to include these little trees that are standing up over there. I'm going to change the exposure one last time, now to 10 seconds. So that's 2/3 of a stop's change. So I've gone from f13 to 11 and then 10 to add 2 stops extra light back into the scene by widening the aperture. And there we have our final photograph. So when you're taking long exposures, especially of things like clouds and waterfalls and streams and rivers and sea, there's one question that should always come to mind, and that is how much motion blur is too much motion blur. So I personally don't like just constant blur across the whole frame because you lose some of the interesting details such as the texture, the shape and the tone of the colors in the clouds. When you go for too long, 30 seconds, a minute or longer, you lose all of that. It can look good in certain situations, but I prefer to keep some of that in the scene, which is why I experiment with different shutter speeds while shooting. So that's how I shoot long exposures of the clouds. I hope you learned something in this video. Go ahead and leave a comment below and let me know if you have any thoughts, and I'd be happy to get back to you. Thanks for watching.